Carl Jung warned us, when the empath snaps, it's already over. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. If you've ever felt like you're carrying the emotional weight of the world, this message is for you. Empaths aren't just sensitive, they're spiritual mirrors, absorbing pain that isn't theirs, until one day, they break. But what if snapping isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough? In this video, we'll uncover the psychological and spiritual tipping point that Carl Jung warned us about when the empath finally reaches their energetic limit. What happens after that can be life-changing. Have you ever reached your limit and snapped, only to discover a deeper version of yourself waiting on the other side? If so, share your experience in the comments. Let's grow together. One, empaths absorb emotional toxins like sponges. Empaths live without psychological skin, absorbing the emotional weight of others like invisible sponges, not out of weakness, but because their spiritual nervous system is wired to feel deeply and universally. They don't just notice pain, they embody it, often before the person in pain even realizes it's there. This heightened emotional intelligence, rooted in mirror neuron hyperresponsivity, is a spiritual gift mistaken by society as oversensitivity. But what looks like fragility is actually a form of rare inner vision, a sensitivity so refined it can detect unspoken wounds and energetic dissonance in any room. Yet this sacred sensitivity becomes dangerous when unconscious. Without awareness, the empath becomes a container for everyone else's emotional residue, carrying not only their feelings, but their unhealed shadow projections, rage that hasn't been owned, sorrow that hasn't been expressed, fear that hasn't been faced. In modern life, this manifests as chronic anxiety, exhaustion after social interaction, or even physical illness with no logical cause. The empath begins to believe they are broken, when in reality, they are saturated. People-pleasing becomes a survival mechanism, not because the empath lacks strength, but because they've been conditioned to believe that harmony is worth self-erasure. This creates an emotional fog where they can't distinguish their energy from others, and every harsh word, silent judgment, or subtle rejection lodges into their nervous system like a psychic bruise. And the worst part? They often blame themselves for it, internalizing chaos that never belonged to them in the first place. Carl Jung warned that what remains unconscious rules our lives, and for empaths, this is especially true. The burden of absorbing other people's pain becomes a silent identity until spiritual awakening cracks it open. Once awakened, the empath begins to ask, what if this sensitivity isn't a curse, but a compass? What if I can feel deeply without drowning? This is where the inner shift begins, not in suppressing emotion, but in recognizing energetic sovereignty. Through spiritual practice, boundary work, grounding, and self-inquiry, the empath transforms from emotional sponge into conscious observer. They stop merging and start witnessing. They no longer carry what isn't theirs, but learn to hold presence without attachment. Their sensitivity no longer enslaves them, it sharpens them. It becomes a force of discernment rather than distortion. The empath doesn't stop feeling. They start feeling with clarity. This is the power of spiritual wisdom. To see that the same sensitivity that once overwhelmed you is the very thing that can elevate you when it is no longer hijacked by the unconscious projections of others. comment below. I cleanse my energy daily. If you're ready to stop carrying what isn't yours and protect your spiritual peace. 2. Carl Jung's shadow carrier concept. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow carrier reveals a painful yet liberating truth. Many highly sensitive individuals unconsciously absorb the emotional shadows others cannot face: repressed guilt, hidden shame, silent rage, and invisible sorrow. This isn't compassion gone too far, it's energetic entanglement. The empath becomes a spiritual sponge, soaking up the emotional toxins others leave behind, not out of malice, but because they lack the self-awareness or emotional courage to own their inner darkness. And as this burden grows heavier, the empath begins to question themselves. You start thinking something's wrong with you. Why am I always so anxious, so tired, so overwhelmed? Why do I feel like I'm drowning in invisible storms no one else seems to notice? It's because what you're feeling often isn't yours. You're carrying the denied emotions of those around you, and their projections distort your self-image. You mistake absorption for identity, assuming that the emotional chaos you sense must originate within. But in truth, you're just the one brave enough or sensitive enough to feel what others refuse to acknowledge. This is where the spiritual damage begins. When an empath doesn't know they're a shadow carrier, they internalize other people's wounds as their own flaws. You might feel like you're too intense, too fragile, too much for the world. But what if you're not too much? What if you're just too open in a world that's too closed off? In spirituality, every energy exchange has a consequence, and empaths often bleed spiritually because they mistake emotional labor for love and psychic absorption for service. Over time, this lack of energetic boundaries leads to a fracture in your spiritual development. You begin to confuse compassion with self-sacrifice, intuition with responsibility, love with rescue. But Jung warned us that the unconscious will rule our lives unless we make it conscious. And for empaths, this means learning the difference between what is yours and what never was. The snapping of the empath is not a collapse, but a sacred rupture. It's the moment when the soul says no more, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The empath's eruption is not about rage, it's about release. It's a spiritual awakening disguised as a breakdown. You walk into a room and feel the silence vibrating. You sense the conflict behind someone's smile. You carry the grief that no one dares to speak of. This is not weakness. It is sensitivity tuned to the frequency of truth. But if you don't learn to protect that sensitivity, it will become a curse instead of a gift. The journey of spiritual development is learning how to feel deeply without drowning, how to care without collapsing, and how to carry your light without becoming a dumping ground for shadows. You are not a broken being. You are a sacred mirror. And the moment you begin to discern what belongs to you and what doesn't, you begin to heal. You begin to reclaim your energy, your peace, your truth. You realize that spirituality is not about absorbing the world's pain. It's about transmuting it, and that only happens when you stop carrying what was never yours in the first place. 3. Participation, mystique and psychological overwhelm. Carl Jung's concept of participation mystique reveals a haunting truth for the empath. You don't just feel others, you fuse with them. Your spirit, wide open and unguarded, becomes a sponge for emotions that were never yours to carry. You take on your mother's guilt, your partner's insecurity, your friend's bitterness, and your coworker's fear. And because your spiritual wisdom is rooted in deep emotional intelligence, you think it's your job to fix what isn't broken inside you. But this isn't healing, it's entanglement. It's an unconscious merging that leaves you fragmented, confused, and drowning in energetic residue. You begin to forget where you end, and others begin. Their shame becomes your inner critic. Their chaos becomes your restlessness. Their emptiness becomes your silent grief. This is the psychological infection Carl Jung warned us about when the unconscious shadows of others are deposited into your psychic system, and you, unknowingly, accept them as your identity. You wake up tired without knowing why. You feel heavy after conversations that seem normal to everyone else. You second-guess your intuition, not realizing it's been layered with emotional noise from the outside world. Empaths often think they are sensitive, but the truth is deeper. They are boundaryless mystics in a world that thrives on emotional transaction. The narcissist, the manipulator, the wounded, these people don't just take your kindness. They energetically offload their darkness into you. Because you don't resist. Because you're wired to feel. But what happens when the empath stops absorbing and starts remembering? That's when the snap comes, and it's quiet. It's not an explosion, it's a reclamation. When the empath snaps, they don't yell. They detach. They go no contact. They walk away without a warning, without a war. Because the war was inside them all along. And when their spirit finally reaches its saturation point, when the soul says, enough, the empath begins to shed everything that was never theirs. That is the turning point. That's when the healing begins. But by then, it's already over for those who mistook their silence for weakness, who confused their softness with servitude, who thought the empath would never leave because they always stayed. This is not an emotional drama. This is spiritual clarity. You see, intelligence isn't just in logic or words. It's in how your nervous system reads energy, how your heart filters unspoken truth, how your body responds before your mind can explain. And yet, without awareness, that intelligence turns inward and becomes a weapon against yourself. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But when only one person transforms and the other continues to dump, that's not alchemy, it's self-destruction." To the empath, your softness must be fortified by structure. Your gift must be guarded by grounded awareness. Your love must be held within a container of self-respect. Emotional fusion is not empathy. Absorbing pain is not the purpose. So when you begin to feel the unraveling, when you realize the anxiety isn't yours, the doubt isn't yours, the guilt isn't yours, you are awakening. You are remembering. You are returning to yourself. And that truly is when the empath becomes untouchable. Have you ever felt like you were drowning in someone else's energy without even realizing it? If you've experienced this kind of invisible entanglement, share your story in the comments below so others can feel less alone. If this concept is new to you, comment, "I will observe my energy boundaries," so we can start this journey of spiritual awareness together. 4. The breakdown is a breakthrough in disguise. Eventually, The empath reaches a point where the soul can no longer tolerate the weight of silent suffering. This snapping point is not a sign of failure, but a signal of transformation. What appears to others as a breakdown is, in truth, a sacred dismantling of an intelligent, spiritual recalibration. The psyche, overwhelmed by years of repression, unmet needs, and unspoken boundaries, initiates a controlled collapse to make space for the emergence of the true self. Carl Jung warned that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And this moment of inner implosion is precisely that, the unconscious rising to reclaim its rightful place. The empath, who has carried the emotional burdens of others, suddenly finds they can no longer suppress the scream of their own soul. This isn't sensitivity gone wrong. It's energetic wisdom asserting itself. The rage that erupts is not dysfunction, but long-neglected truth demanding recognition. In spiritual awakening, this moment is not the end, it's the initiation. The empath does not shatter because they are weak, but because they are finally strong enough to stop lying to themselves. This psychic rupture becomes a spiritual breakthrough when the empath realizes their exhaustion is not a flaw, but a feedback mechanism. The nervous system shuts down, not out of failure, but out of protection. The tears, the rage, the withdrawal, these are sacred symptoms of a system detoxing from emotional slavery. In modern life, burnout is romanticized as a side effect of ambition. But in spiritual wisdom, it's often the soul's way of saying, enough. The empath has reached the edge of false peace and now must choose authenticity over approval. And this choice, though painful, is the birth of personal sovereignty. No longer able to play the role of the silent healer or the emotional sponge, the empath awakens to their own inner authority. Their too much becomes their power. Their collapse becomes their clarity. The walls they built to protect others now fall to reveal the sacred core of their own truth. In this space of radical honesty, the empath begins to set boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of deep self-respect. When the world around them sees only chaos, the empath is actually remembering who they were before the world taught them to forget. The spiritual awakening disguises itself as an emotional crisis, but what it really brings is rebirth. This is not the unraveling of someone losing their mind. It's the arrival of someone reclaiming their soul. The empath is no longer available for self-betrayal. They are no longer willing to spiritualize their own suppression. They realize that the most sacred service they can offer is to become whole. And so, in this breakdown, this holy undoing, they don't fall apart. They fall into alignment. They don't collapse to escape life. They collapse to finally live it. 5. The shadow is a hidden treasure chest. Carl Jung taught us that the shadow is not just a container of our flaws, but a forgotten vault of power, an inner realm where our rejected strengths have been buried alive beneath layers of shame, fear, and societal conditioning. For empaths, this truth is especially urgent. Since childhood, many empaths have been trained to equate anger with danger, to see boundaries as betrayals, to mistake exhaustion for compassion, and to silence their inner voice in order to remain likable. But what if the very things you were taught to hide your righteous anger, your need for space, your instinct to say no, are not spiritual failures, but spiritual gifts in disguise? What if your anger is not violence, but clarity, not destruction, but the fire that forges healthy distance? What if your selfishness is not greed, but sacred self-preservation, the necessary act of keeping your soul intact in a world that constantly pulls you into its chaos? Jung warned that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. And when the empath resists the shadow, it builds silently until it erupts. When an empath snaps, it's not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. It's the soul reclaiming its voice after years of spiritual silence. That suppressed no becomes the superpower that frees you from emotional slavery. That guilt over choosing yourself transforms into the fuel for radical healing. True spirituality is not about being endlessly agreeable. It is about standing rooted in your truth with grace and fire. Spiritual development means reclaiming the fragmented parts of yourself and weaving them into a whole that no longer depends on validation to feel worthy. The empath's shadow is not a curse. It is the map back to sovereignty. And the moment you choose to own it, to sit with it, to bless it instead of fearing it, you become something no one can manipulate. Integrated, self-aware, energetically protected. Spirituality is not about floating above the mess of life. It is about descending into your own depths, facing what was hidden, and rising with the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving your own darkness. Integration does not harden you. It solidifies you. It does not make you cruel. It makes you clear. When you accept the parts of yourself you once abandoned, you no longer attract relationships that depend on your self-erasure. You begin to feel peace in saying no, power in setting limits, and freedom in walking away. You stop leaking energy, trying to be everything to everyone, and start becoming fully yourself. That is when your presence becomes a force field. That is when your aura speaks before you do. That is when your spiritual development stops being a concept and starts becoming a lived frequency. And in that frequency, you do not just heal, you transform. You do not just awaken, you remember who you were before the world told you to forget. If you're ready to unlock the hidden treasure within your shadow, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's claim this transformation together. 6. From emotional sponge to conscious fortress. After the transformation, the empath no longer moves through life as a helpless absorber of emotional debris, but instead becomes a finely tuned instrument of discernment, embodying a kind of spiritual wisdom that Carl Jung hinted at when he spoke of making the unconscious conscious. No longer reactive, the awakened empath develops an internal compass that senses manipulation, projection, and energetic infiltration before it ever breaches their field. What was once chaotic compassion becomes intelligent empathy, sharp, selective, sovereign. Their boundaries are no longer guilt-soaked or porous. They become living membranes of intuitive intelligence, shaped by pain, forged by experience, and protected by purpose. This is not coldness, it is clarity. This is not detachment, it is emotional maturity. What breaks is not the empath's kindness, but their pattern of self-abandonment. The snapping of the empath is not an explosion, it is a holy silence, a spiritual refusal. They stop absorbing and start observing. They do not argue with dysfunction, they outgrow it. They no longer bend to make others feel tall, nor shrink to preserve fragile egos. They see the energetic cost of chronic self-sacrifice and finally decide to pay attention to their own frequency. The awakened empath doesn't just say no, they embody no. Their presence becomes a boundary. Their absence becomes protection. Their distance becomes discernment. What once kept them trapped, guilt, people-pleasing, emotional debt, is now the very thing they shed to breathe. They realize that rescuing is not love, that absorbing pain is not healing, and that spiritual intelligence includes the courage to walk away. As Jung warned, the shadow that is not integrated will act out in unconscious ways. But when the empath embraces their own shadow, they don't become bitter. They become whole. They reclaim their anger as sacred fire, their silence as power, their solitude as sanctuary. No longer do they confuse chaos with chemistry or loyalty with self-erasure. They recognize projection for what it is, the wound of another trying to live in disguise, and they stop letting it live in them. This transformation isn't a performance. It's a return, a remembering. They do not harden, they refine. They do not shut down, they elevate. Their energy becomes rare. Their love becomes clean. Their yes becomes a prayer. Their not a full sentence. When the empath snaps, it's not the beginning of war, it's the end of illusion. They stop mistaking emotional labor for worth. They stop interpreting exhaustion as proof of love. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They trust the vibration more than the apology, the silence more than the excuse, the feeling more than the words. They no longer seek to be chosen. They choose themselves. And that choice becomes an energetic force field, one that says, I see clearly now, and I will not trade my peace for your chaos. Because once the empath awakens, their compassion becomes calibrated, their energy becomes expensive, and their soul finally stops bleeding for what was never theirs to carry. Seven, the individuation process, becoming whole. Jung called this transformation the process of individuation, the sacred integration of the ego, the shadow, and the true self. It's not a theory, it's a spiritual awakening that begins the moment the empath stops contorting themselves to fit into other people's comfort zones, no longer ruled by people-pleasing or haunted by the need for external validation. The empath begins to peel back the layers of false identity and reclaim the parts of themselves they once gave away to feel safe, accepted, or loved. The emotional exhaustion, once mistaken as kindness, is revealed as chronic self-abandonment. And in its place rises a new kind of power, quiet, unwavering, and sovereign. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The empath, through deep inner work, begins to reverse that fate. They learn to feel deeply without dissolving into others' pain, to think clearly without absorbing chaotic energy, and to act wisely without waiting for permission. This shift is seismic. The empath no longer interprets their sensitivity as weakness, but as a compass pointing toward truth. They stop seeing boundaries as walls and start seeing them as sacred containers that preserve their emotional clarity. Their presence no longer seeks approval. It commands respect, not through force, but through alignment. Where they once gave without limits, they now offer from fullness, not depletion. The ego that once screamed for recognition becomes quiet, integrated, and in service to the soul's deeper rhythm. The empath doesn't stop caring. They care consciously. They choose their battles, speak their truth without trembling, and withdraw from spaces that insult their spirit. What once looked like withdrawal is now discernment. What once felt like guilt is now grace. In modern life, this transformation is radical. It might look like quitting a job that drains your spirit, ending relationships that thrive on your silence, or simply refusing to explain your peace to those who profit from your chaos. You no longer perform compassion, you embody it. You no longer sacrifice your well-being to prove your love. You no longer bend yourself to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. And when the empath snaps, it's not an explosion, it's an emancipation. It's the end of emotional servitude and the birth of spiritual authority. The empath becomes whole not by fixing the world, but by no longer betraying themselves in the process. This is the path of intelligence, spiritual wisdom, and true awakening, not as a destination, but as a daily devotion to inner alignment. 8. Empowered empaths as healers of the collective. The conscious empath is not merely on a personal healing journey. They are walking, breathing medicine for a planet in emotional distress. In a time when humanity is suffocating under emotional contagion, performative compassion, and digital overwhelm, the empowered empath becomes a spiritual force of nature. They no longer confuse overgiving with love or call self-abandonment a virtue. Instead, they embody a new kind of spirituality, one rooted not in denial, but in depth. Every time they hold space without absorbing toxicity, they disrupt centuries of codependent programming. Each act of discernment becomes an energetic transmission, showing others that boundaries are not walls, but bridges to healthier connection. As Carl Jung warned, the failure to integrate one's unconscious creates projection, and the empath's gift is precisely this: to stop carrying what isn't theirs and begin reflecting what others refuse to see in themselves. This reflection is sacred. It shakes people. It awakens them. To be a conscious empath is to live with open senses and a protected soul. No longer drowning in everyone else's pain, they become the alchemist, not the sponge. They understand that feeling everything is not a curse, but an invitation to feel wisely. In a world that labels deep feelers as broken, they rise as educators of emotional intelligence. And when they stop rescuing those who resist their own growth, they reclaim power that was never meant to be sacrificed. They no longer perform healing. They live it. And that authenticity is magnetic. People feel it not in what the empath says, but in what they no longer tolerate. When an empath says no, it echoes as truth in every direction. That no teaches others to take responsibility for their own energy. That no teaches the world that self-respect is a form of love. And in that sacred refusal to betray themselves, empaths become spiritual leaders without needing titles or followers. Their spirituality is not performative, it's protective. Their spiritual development is not linear, it's layered, messy, alive. They learn to rest without guilt. They learn that their silence is medicine. They learn to disconnect, not to punish, but to recharge. Because what the world needs is not more burnt-out empaths. It needs empaths who are awake, rooted, and energetically sovereign. When they stop absorbing dysfunction and start observing it, they become immune to manipulation. They start seeing through charm and into intention. They trust their nervous system more than someone's excuses. And in doing so, they model a new template for humanity, one where empathy does not equal emotional enslavement, where compassion has clarity, and where sensitivity becomes strength. Their boundaries are no longer about pushing people away. They are about inviting only those who can meet them in truth. Every time they choose self-respect over approval, they break ancestral chains. Every time they rest instead of explain, they restore their soul. They are no longer mirrors for other people's projections. They are windows into another way of being. And in their presence, others remember what real feels like. If this message resonated with you, it's because you were meant to hear it. The empath doesn't break easily, but when they do, it means something sacred within them has awakened. If you've ever felt the weight of others' emotions pressing down on your soul, know that you're not alone, and more importantly, you are powerful beyond what the world can see. Thank you for watching Spiritual Wisdom. If this video brought you clarity or strength, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos on spiritual growth, emotional healing, and the deeper truths Carl Jung tried to show us. Until next time, protect your energy, honor your truth, and remember, when the empath finally snaps, it's not the end. It's the beginning of their power. The woman who needs no one. Carl Jung reveals her secret strength. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens. Carl Jung. In a world that often measures a woman's worth by her relationships, there emerges a rare kind of woman, one who is whole on her own. Her power doesn't come from rebellion, but from radical self-respect. She's not hard to love. She's just done proving her worth. This video will unveil the quiet strength and deep emotional intelligence behind the woman who doesn't chase, beg, or settle. Her solitude isn't loneliness, it's sacred space. As you listen, ask yourself, have you met her, or are you becoming her? Drop a comment below if you feel this energy rising in you. Let's talk about what it truly means to stand in your own spiritual awakening and embody unshakable self-worth. 1. Wholeness without dependency. She is not broken. She is whole. And that terrifies a world built on dependency. A woman who chooses solitude over validation, depth over distraction, presence over performance, is not just rejecting tradition, she is embodying a new form of power. Her independence is not defiance. It is alignment. In a culture that insists a woman's worth is measured by who she belongs to, she becomes dangerous the moment she belongs to herself. She's not waiting to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. And in doing so, she has disrupted everything we've been conditioned to believe about love, femininity, and fulfillment. This isn't about avoiding relationships. It's about refusing to lose yourself inside of them. The woman who needs no one has already journeyed to her own depths, sat in the silence of her soul, and returned with a truth so radiant it no longer requires external confirmation. She doesn't crave a savior. She has become her own. She doesn't chase approval. She validates her existence through her breath, her presence, her peace. She understands what most fear to admit, that solitude is not loneliness, it's sovereignty. The moment she stopped fearing her own company, she became untouchable by society's projections. She no longer accepts emotional crumbs. She no longer shrinks to fit someone else's narrative. Her strength lies not in how much she can endure for love, but in how fiercely she protects her own energy. Her boundaries are not walls. They are sacred rituals of self-respect. And while others may whisper that she's too much, too strong, too distant, they fail to see that her distance is not detachment, it is discernment. She does not open herself to those who have not earned the right to witness her light. Her silence speaks louder than noise, her absence more powerful than presence, because she knows that not everyone deserves access to her energy, and not every connection is meant to be kept. This is the kind of spiritual awakening that Carl Jung understood: the individuation of the soul, the integration of shadow and light, the wholeness that comes not from attachment, but from inner truth. She has stepped outside the collective script and written her own. Her life is no longer dictated by the expectations of others, but by the rhythm of her intuition. She has learned that to walk alone is not a curse, but a privilege. That to be misunderstood is not failure, but freedom. She moves through the world not with arrogance, but with grounded knowing. She doesn't need to explain why she's single, why she's quiet, why she's different. Her existence is not an invitation for commentary. It is a living testimony that spirituality is not something you perform, it is something you live. And in her stillness, in her clarity, in her unwavering presence, she becomes the very embodiment of divine feminine power. Have you ever felt complete without needing anyone to validate your worth? If so, share your story in the comments so others can find strength in it. If not, simply comment, "I will trust my wholeness," and let this be your first step towards spiritual wisdom and self-reliance. 2. From pain to power. She didn't retreat into solitude out of bitterness or fear. She arrived there through the fire of healing. She didn't isolate because she was wounded, but because she became wise. She had tasted the sting of emotional neglect, the ache of abandonment, the quiet devastation of waiting for someone to meet her where she always met others. And in that darkness, something extraordinary happened. Instead of reaching outward for someone to complete her, she turned inward and met the one person she had been waiting for all along herself. This was not a surface-level shift, but a soul-level reawakening. She stopped mistaking attention for affection, chaos for passion, silence for safety. She began to see through the illusion of codependency that the world wraps in romance, and with every tear she shed alone, she planted a new seed of power. Her solitude is not emptiness. It is sacred space. It is the ground where clarity took root, and where her voice, once silenced by the noise of others' expectations, grew thunderous in its truth. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." She did exactly that. And what she saw wasn't a broken woman, but one who had been buried under years of false roles, unspoken sacrifices, and emotional debris that didn't belong to her. She saw that her pain was not punishment, it was preparation. She didn't just survive what she went through, she transmuted it into wisdom, and that wisdom became her new compass. Her emotional intelligence was carved out of disappointments that once threatened to undo her, and now she navigates life with a sacred non-negotiable: peace. The woman who needs no one is not unreachable. She's just unwilling to trade her soul for shallow comfort. She will not diminish her light to be seen by those who fear their own. Her boundaries are not barriers. They are invitations for only those with spiritual maturity to enter. Spirituality, for her, is not an escape from life. It is a devotion to truth, a reverence for her own energy, and a commitment to never abandoning herself again. She no longer waits for someone to notice her worth because she is too busy embodying it. She doesn't confuse being chosen with being valued. She understands that real love is not proven by grand gestures, but by consistency, respect, and emotional safety. And until it arrives in that form, she will remain in her sanctuary, rooted in self-worth, nourished by solitude, lit by the quiet fire of spiritual development. She lives in a world where women are taught that partnership is the goal, but she walks a path where wholeness is the destination, not because she doesn't believe in love, but because she finally believes in herself. The world may call her too much, too strong, too distant, but that's only because they've never met a woman who knows how to hold herself. And when you encounter a woman like this, don't ask her why she's alone. Ask yourself if you're ready to meet her where she already met herself. If you've ever turned your pain into power, comment below. I rise through the storm. If not yet, let this be your moment to begin. Subscribe for more spiritual wisdom and awaken the strength within you. 3. Carl Jung and shadow integration. She is not lonely. She is luminous in her own light. The woman who needs no one has walked the path of shadow integration Carl Jung so often spoke of. She didn't just read about spirituality, she lived it. She descended into the forgotten places within herself, where unhealed wounds and unconscious beliefs tried to rule her life. And with radical courage, she sat with those shadows until they revealed their wisdom. She faced her emotional ghosts, not to destroy them, but to understand them, to reclaim every fragmented part of herself. And in doing so, she emerged not as a version of who the world expected her to be, but as her own complete self. In Jung's words, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. And that is what she has done. She has integrated her contradictions, her softness and strength, her wildness and wisdom into a coherent, unshakable inner presence. This woman is not driven by the need to be chosen. She is driven by the deep spiritual wisdom that reminds her, I am already whole. While the world tells her that fulfillment comes through external partnership, she has discovered that true love begins not with another person, but with sacred solitude. She no longer begs for love dressed as validation. She no longer tolerates emotional crumbs from those who fear the depth of her soul. Instead, she has cultivated a rare intelligence, a spiritual sovereignty that most people are too distracted or afraid to pursue. Her peace disturbs those who are addicted to chaos. Her clarity threatens those who benefit from confusion. She is not hard to love. She simply refuses to be loved poorly. Her life reflects a quiet revolution. She no longer seeks to be understood by those who do not even understand themselves. She has stopped performing for acceptance and started choosing alignment. Carl Jung taught that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But she has done the opposite. She has faced her soul and made it her home. She doesn't fill empty spaces with noise or people who cannot meet her depth. She fills it with intention, beauty, and purpose. Her solitude is sacred, not sad. Her independence is not arrogance, it is discipline. She no longer needs anyone to complete her because she has remembered what society tried to make her forget, that the deepest union is with your own truth. And so, when she walks into a room, she doesn't demand attention, she alters the frequency. She is not loud, but she is undeniable. She is not dependent, but she is deeply connected to herself, to source, to purpose. The world calls her intimidating because they've never seen a woman who doesn't compromise her soul for connection. She is not here to chase, to please, or to perform. She is here to reflect the possibility of wholeness back to a world still asleep in its own illusions. Her presence is a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see what it reveals. But for those who are, she becomes a spiritual lighthouse, a rare reminder that the path to true power begins not with being needed, but with being whole. Don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom on how Carl Jung's shadow integration can transform your deepest pain into your greatest power. Four, presence over performance. She no longer waits for someone to choose her because she understands that choosing herself is the most radical act of love and intelligence. She isn't trying to prove her worth through relationships that demand her silence, nor does she shrink to make others feel comfortable. Her presence is her answer. When she walks into a room, it's not her words that speak. It's the calm, anchored energy that tells you she has walked through fire and chosen to rise, not to please, but to become. People may say she's too distant or too hard to reach, but that's only because they are not used to a woman who doesn't negotiate her soul. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And she has. That is her secret strength, not independence for the sake of defiance, but spiritual clarity that refuses to perform for validation. She no longer needs to be admired to feel whole, nor does she measure her value by who desires her. She recognizes the games, the masks, the subtle manipulations of a world still obsessed with female submission, and she simply opts out. She has replaced desperation with discernment. Her no is a boundary rooted in self-respect, not cruelty. Her solitude isn't a cry for attention. It is the result of deep spiritual awakening, where peace becomes more attractive than performance. While others chase attention in fear of being forgotten, she embraces quiet because she knows the soul speaks loudest in silence. Her clarity is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefit from confusion. But she doesn't care to explain. Her life is not an audition, it's an embodiment. She no longer engages in love that feels like war. If affection demands that she abandon herself, it is no longer love, it is a transaction, and she's no longer for sale. Her softness is earned, not offered cheaply. She doesn't seek to be mysterious. She's simply not here to be consumed. The path she walks is not paved with approval, but with alignment. She chooses relationships that hold space for her essence, not just her appearance. Her energy is sacred, and she treats it as such. In a culture that teaches women to bend, break, and beautify their wounds for male comfort, she stands as a quiet rebellion whole, unbothered, and deeply rooted in truth. Spirituality has taught her that presence is more powerful than performance. Her healing journey wasn't pretty, but it was real. She sat with her shadows, held her inner child, and listened to the echoes of past versions of herself begging to be seen. And now that she has seen herself, no one can make her unseen. She's no longer addicted to being chosen because she has chosen herself every single day, even when it was lonely, even when it was misunderstood. And that choice became her power. Carl Jung reminds us, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. And she lives this truth. She doesn't have to prove her depth, it is felt. She doesn't ask to be understood. She simply exists as a frequency few can meet. Five, redefining love. She still wants love, but not the kind that demands she abandons herself in exchange for affection. Not the kind that asks her to trade her silence for security or her truth for belonging. She wants a love that allows her to remain whole while being held, a love rooted in reciprocity, where both hearts offer depth, presence, and emotional maturity. She no longer tolerates performance-based affection, shallow compliments, or connections built on convenience. For her, true love has nothing to do with possession or saving someone from loneliness. It's about two sovereign souls who walk side by side without leaning so heavily that one disappears into the other. She knows now that completion doesn't come from another person. It comes from spiritual development, from returning to herself over and over again until her own company feels like peace. As Carl Jung taught, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And she has made the unconscious conscious. She has turned inward and found her truth in solitude, embraced her wounds with compassion, and met herself with reverence. This kind of self-awareness has redefined what love means to her. It is no longer the fantasy of being chosen or saved. It is the daily act of choosing someone who chooses themselves too. Someone who sees her strength not as a threat, but as an invitation to rise in their own power. She doesn't crave attention anymore. She values intention. She's not seduced by charm, but by consistency. Her heart doesn't beat faster for someone who texts late at night, but for the one who shows up early and often. She doesn't need promises whispered in the dark. She needs presence in the light of day. She is no longer impressed by those who only want her when it's convenient, because she has become a woman who honors her own time, her own energy, her own boundaries. In her spiritual journey, she's learned that peace is not something to be negotiated. Her silence is sacred. Her independence is not armor, it's clarity. And if someone cannot meet her at the level of depth she lives at, she no longer lowers herself to be understood. She has become fluent in the language of solitude. Her standards are not walls, they are thresholds. And the right person will not be intimidated by the fire in her eyes, but warmed by it. She doesn't wait to be loved anymore. She lives as love. She has realized that being alone is not the same as being lonely. It's a form of devotion to her inner world. She's not afraid of the space between relationships because she uses it to grow, to reflect, to expand. She is not half looking for a whole. She is a whole woman who knows that any relationship must add to her life, not subtract from it. That kind of clarity isn't cold, it's sacred. That kind of discipline is not rigid, it's radiant. She knows now that a love worth having doesn't cost your peace. A love worth growing doesn't require you to shrink. And a love that truly sees you will never ask you to disappear. So she redefines love not through longing, but through embodiment. Not through fantasy, but through alignment. Because in the depth of her solitude, she has discovered the most spiritual truth of all. The relationship she was searching for outside herself has always lived within. Does this redefine what love means to you? Comment, "I agree," if this resonates with your truth. Or, "I don't think so." If your view is different, your voice matters in this spiritual conversation. 6. A new feminine archetype. She is not broken, bitter, or cold. She is simply whole. She doesn't seek validation through romantic entanglements or base her worth on being chosen by anyone else. She is self-sourced, spiritually awake, and emotionally sovereign, embodying a rare intelligence that society doesn't know how to define because it cannot control her. Her silence unsettles people. Her peace confuses those who equate stillness with emptiness. Her boundaries challenge everything we've been conditioned to expect from a woman. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that is exactly what she has done. She has stopped running, stopped pleasing, stopped diluting her essence to fit someone else's version of love. She walks through life as her own source of fulfillment, no longer asking for permission to exist deeply. Her worth is not found in a glance, a text, or an invitation, but in the way she honors her truth in every breath, every step, every choice. This is not the woman who clings to the hope of being saved. This is the woman who has walked through fire, who has faced the dark mirror of her own soul, and emerged not burned, but illuminated. She's not afraid of solitude because she no longer mistakes loneliness for lack. She knows that sometimes silence is a sanctuary. Sometimes boundaries are a form of love. She's not here to perform for approval. She is here to embody presence. Her energy doesn't chase at commands. She magnetizes without effort because she doesn't strive to impress. She strives to align. Her femininity is not defined by fragility or need. It's defined by depth, discernment, and the ability to say no without guilt and yes without fear. Her path is not for the faint-hearted because it requires a deep spiritual awakening, the kind that strips away illusions and demands truth over comfort. She no longer settles for half love or potential. She's not enticed by almosts or promises. She knows that real connection begins with the self, that the soul can only meet another soul when it has first met itself. Carl Jung's concept of individuation is alive in her. She has become whole by integrating all the fragmented parts of her identity, her pain, her longing, her power. And now, she doesn't just survive. She radiates. She doesn't beg to be seen. She chooses when to reveal herself. She doesn't explain her solitude. It explains her. While the world still measures a woman's worth by who wants her, she measures hers by who she becomes when she is alone. She is not rejecting love. She is refining her frequency until love arrives that recognizes her as its equal, not its escape. In a culture that teaches women to fear being alone, she stands as a quiet revolution. Her very existence is a disruption to every script that says her value lies in her ability to be needed. She doesn't need to be needed. She needs to be free. And in that freedom, she has become rare, untouchable, magnetic, not because she's unreachable, but because she's finally reached herself. She is the woman who needs no one, not out of pride, but out of presence, not out of bitterness, but out of balance. not out of fear, but out of full embodiment. This is not rebellion. This is remembrance. This is not avoidance. This is alignment. This is not ego. This is evolution. 7. Spiritual awakening as rebellion. In a culture that idolizes romantic connection as the ultimate validation, the woman who walks alone becomes a quiet rebellion. She isn't seeking approval. She isn't waiting to be completed. She already is. Her solitude isn't an absence of love. It's a presence of self. Her energy no longer pleads to be seen because she has already seen herself. What others mistake for being too independent is actually spiritual awakening in motion. She has stopped chasing projections and started embodying truth. As Carl Jung described through the process of individuation, she has peeled away the masks, burned the scripts, and reclaimed her wholeness not as an act of defiance, but as a return to essence. She no longer performs femininity to be palatable. She no longer contorts herself to fit within the lines drawn by someone else's imagination of what a woman should be. Her transformation is not performative. It is energetic, cellular, and irreversible. She threatens the system not by what she says, but by what she no longer needs to say. There is power in her silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of sovereignty. People feel the shift in her presence. They don't know why they're drawn to her, or why they feel slightly unsettled around her. But it's because she's not playing the game. She's not addicted to being desired. She's free. That kind of freedom is magnetic and deeply unsettling to those still trapped in the belief that worth comes from being chosen. Her path wasn't handed to her. She carved it through loneliness, through late nights of spiritual reckoning, through the sacred art of not settling. She has learned to hold herself emotionally, spiritually, energetically. She became the love she was taught to beg for. She became the mirror that doesn't distort. And now, she walks through life as her own home. This is not detachment. This is a deep connection to soul, to source, to self. And because she no longer clings, she no longer suffers from absence. She can love, but she will never grasp. She can give, but not from depletion. She becomes the embodiment of a truth society isn't ready to face, that the most powerful woman is the one who does not need to be saved, fixed, or chosen. Her wholeness is her revolution. She doesn't wait for love. She radiates it. She doesn't chase validation. She stands in resonance. And her existence alone invites others to awaken, to question, to remember. In this lifetime, she didn't come to conform. She came to remind the world of a forgotten truth. That divinity begins with self-recognition, and that no union, no matter how romantic, can replace the spiritual home you build within. 8. Sacred solitude as home. She is not distant. She is deliberate. And her silence is not emptiness, but a sacred space of intention, where her soul breathes freely and her boundaries are honored. In a world obsessed with validation and constant companionship, she has chosen solitude not as a retreat, but as her reclamation, a return to the self that never needed to be fixed, only remembered. She is not hiding from love. She is guarding her frequency, attuned only to that which honors her peace. Her presence is not an invitation for approval, but a declaration of self-worth that needs no echo. While others chase the illusion that partnership will complete them, she has unearthed the deeper truth. Real love is not salvation. It is celebration. And you only attract it when you have already rescued yourself from the hunger for external affirmation. This woman has done the work, faced her shadows, held herself in the dark, and emerged radiant, not because someone pulled her out, but because she lit the fire within. Her spiritual awakening was not loud or dramatic. It was steady and sovereign, a deep unfolding of wisdom that whispered, "Wholeness precedes partnership." She didn't become powerful by accident. She became powerful by refusing to settle, by breaking cycles of codependency, by no longer mistaking crumbs for connection. She has learned to sit in stillness while the world spins in panic, to listen to her intuition when logic fails, to choose clarity over chaos and self-respect over temporary affection. Her energy is disruptive not because it is loud, but because it is clear. Systems built on dependence cannot withstand the presence of someone who no longer needs to be needed. What appears as distance is actually depth. What looks like indifference is discernment. And what you call solitude, she calls sovereignty. The feminine no longer diluted for comfort, no longer shrunken to fit fragile expectations, no longer softened to soothe insecure egos. This woman is dangerous to everything built on performance because her power is rooted in presence. Her love is not given to feel whole. It is offered from a place of wholeness. She is no longer impressed by grand gestures or swayed by hollow words because her spiritual development has taught her that true connection is energy, not entertainment. She does not fear being alone because she has met herself there, and what she found was not emptiness, but everything. She moves like a prayer answered, like a soul returned home. Her life is not a rebellion, it is a sacred realignment. And in every step, she teaches a silent truth. You don't need to be saved. You need to be seen. You don't need to be chosen. You need to remember that you were never unworthy. She embodies a kind of intelligence rooted in spiritual wisdom, not manipulation or control, and that threatens every system that profits off your doubt. In her, we see the embodiment of a truth most are too afraid to claim, that peace is the true prize. That solitude is not suffering, but self-sovereignty, and that the woman who needs no one has become the most magnetic force of all. If this message stirred something deep within you, know that her strength lives in all of us. The woman who needs no one has learned to belong fully to herself. And in doing so, she becomes magnetic, not because she seeks love, but because she is love. If you found wisdom in this journey, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs this message, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. Tap the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming insights on spiritual awakening, personal power, and the psychology of transformation. Stay radiant, stay sovereign,